Well, what's the current environment of international corruption? Well, as opposed to what many consider to be in their view, what international corruption is, bribery, basically cash being handed over in exchange for a favor. That is still happening, but it has become much more sophisticated. And through that, primarily, is the increase in the sophistication of money laundering tied to the corruption. That could be anything related to either bribes. It could be related to the theft of state funds by corrupt government officials, and often it includes the work of middle facilitators, as we will say. Those are professional money launderers. And what do those professional money launderers do? They have very sophisticated enterprise methods of laundering funds. That recently we've seen a very large increase in the use of virtual assets. Obviously, cryptocurrency or virtual assets, whichever you choose to call it, have at least an aura of the ability to conceal funds or make them hard to trace from one point to the other. We have various tools at the FBI which we lend to our partners who may not have the same capabilities in order to help them do trace assets, because in the end they are not completely untraceable. Sophisticated money laundering also exploits global banking systems. And what does that mean? Well, that means basically currencies beyond just one currency. I use the examples here of the dollar, the euro, the British pound sterling, and even the Chinese yen. That Japanese yen. What that really does is create the ability by these money launderers to receive money in one currency and pay and convert it to nothing convert it to another currency in order to complete a bribe, complete the theft of funds. Very often, especially related to kleptocracy matters, or what we would just call simply basically theft of state funds from political figures and their associates. Funds are moved out of the particular country that they're stolen from and placed in outside jurisdictions. And they're very often stolen in one currency and converted to another. And this is why we're finding more and more sophisticated money laundering tied to foreign bribery. Also, what we're also seeing a large increase in corruption tied to the malign influence of state actors. Now, what do I mean about that? Without naming any particular countries, what very often happens is foreign countries try to gain influence in other jurisdictions. And one of the ways they attempt to gain that influence is through corrupt matters. Now, that could be through just straight on payments to public officials, but very often it's done under the guise of other methods. One particular example that I cite right here is infrastructure assistance projects. The assistance is provided under the basically under the view of, well, we are just coming to this country to help them build a railroad, excuse me, or build a port, build a airport. And on its face, that is a very noble and a very what I would say a legitimate endeavor. But very often this is done in relation to corruption, whether it's just to gain the influence and control somewhat over another jurisdiction that maybe have a strategic value, or specifically have a resource for another country, whether that could be a natural resource, that could be a geographic strategic location where it's placed. The Caribbean is a very strategic place for many countries in relation to its proximity to notable countries, particularly the United States, but also Canada, Central and South America. So that's an example. What we often see are state actors who come in under the guise of, well, we're going to possibly provide you with a large, well, usually badly needed infrastructure project, but that will be in exchange for access to a natural resource, or that'll be exchanged to the allowance of maybe, who knows, having a military base. And what happens with this is very often there's corruption related to that. Political officials could be basically compensated under the books in order to make this a reality. So we're seeing an increased amount of basically corruption related to state actors, particularly countries. And finally, and this is has come into the prominence and come into more prominence in the past year, is the sanctioning of individuals and entities by the U.S., by the European Union, by the United Kingdom, by various associations in obviously countries and or regional concerns. I would use the example right there of Task Force Kleptocapture. That was formed by the United States Department of Justice shortly after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And what that did is that would increase the focus and the number of sanctions placed on certain individuals tied to the Russian government, and particularly tied to the Russian government and the military apparatus. U.S. sanctions are imposed. Well, very often, sanctions are also imposed on corrupt individuals. The corruption could be related to South America. It could be related to the Caribbean. If you had a corrupt governmental officer in the Caribbean and the United States had enough evidence to prove that they are, well, the United States may sanction that individual or even members of that individual's family who we believe may possibly be involved in the hiding or the transfer of stolen funds. So there has been a very large increase in sanctioning, especially in the past year. But what I would also say is there's also an increased focus on U.S. investigative agencies and prosecutors to go after individuals who try to evade sanctions. They may be a sanctioned entity, but what they try to do is disguise their assets, try to move their assets from their ownership to another entities. There's been an increase in prosecution by U.S. authorities related to individuals and entities that try to evade sanctions. And I would say that trend is probably going to continue to increase. I do not see that evening off or even being reduced. It has proven to be an effective tool. And again, particularly, and a good example is related to what's going on in Ukraine, but also it can happen both to corrupt officials, even to officials related to war crimes. Those individuals can be sanctioned. And very often what happens is there's evasion, but there's also corruption tied to that. So that is I would say, has become a very significant part of our investigations.